invite a good friend of ours, Dave, up. You may have seen as you came in, there was some little sale. Dave has been a partner, been part of this church really for a long, long time, and been a partner that we have supported over doing work. And so Dave's here with some goodies for us to be able to buy to support the work over there. And just wonder if you can tell us a little bit about what that is and how we can continue.
So I was in Myanmar for nearly 15 years and supported by Gordon Baptist very well during that period. One of the groups that I worked with was a social enterprise with disabled people to try and help them to make a living. They came up with cards and products, which was partly therapeutic, but also partly as a business opportunity. Of course, Myanmar's a mess now, and I can us all to keep praying for Myanmar. And international shipping isn't what it used to be from there, but we had some visitors who came to Australia, and they bought a bag of goodies. So this is a chance. Outside, there's a partnership meeting straight after the church, but after church, if you want to have a look and a browse, it's all handmade. Incredibly, if you look at it, the quality is very high, and it's for a good cause. And we can feel free to ask me any questions. My this social enterprise was to try to get them to be more on to look at the marketing and business, so that it's not just products that people buy, but so they had some customers like the Thai embassy bought some and things like that. So that was all good. The alternative for the disabled people is begging. That's really what they... And they're put into... to try... That's how to... So this is all trying to build an alternative. The name of this enterprise is actually Pananain, and it translates to Royal Creative Home. So it's trying to get that sense of how this can be an alternative to the current lot. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. So ask questions, say hello to Dave. He hasn't been around here for a while, so it's wonderful to have you here visiting us. Yeah. And love Kristen and Samuel as well, who they're not here today, are they? They're not here today, Kristen and Samuel, no. So say hello to Dave afterwards, and a brilliant thing to be supporting as well. So buy your Christmas cards and some other little goodies there. Going to pass over to John as we dive into our last week in Ephesians. Kids can go up to Kids Life if you haven't already. So Shari has already headed up. So.
Thanks, Steve. So nice when he's standing there singing along, don't you think? Shari, who was here before. Is that very echoey? Maybe it sounds echoey to me. Yes? Stand a bit more forward. Thank you, Claire, for sitting in the front row. Morning, everybody. So nice to see you. That is echoey. Anyway, I'll have to put up with it. Try this one. Thank you. How's that? Soft, loud, and not echoey. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so we are at the end of this amazing letter that Paul writes to the ancient community of Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. It's a long letter, at least it's a full letter. And we've seen how Paul does some quite amazing things. He gets us thinking about being seated with Christ in the heavenlies, the resurrected Jesus, whose power is now at work within his church on earth. And he speaks about the revolutionary impact that makes on people and society. For example, it breaks down that dividing wall that split the ancient world in two between Jew and Gentile and says, now you can be one people together. That hostility, that bitterness, that hatred, that prejudice can be done away with. About how the raised Christ renews God's creation purposes for all humanity, that at last we can be liberated to be what we are meant to be. That we can be people, human creatures who express the glory and goodness of God, that we exist for his praise and his power. And he's taught how that liberating experience, that new way of living and walking through life, impacts our households, our daily life in our families, between parents and children, slaves and masters, husbands and wives. The daily living with the resurrected Christ, who inhabits his people by his Spirit, changes our existence. It's an amazing, uplifting, profound letter. As he comes to the end, he does something really strange, or at least it appears strange, but if we think more carefully, it's the very thing Paul always does. Have you ever thought why Paul did what he did? Why he travelled around the ancient world? Why he left home and friends and family and engaged in this weird mission? He travelled the world and went from city to city to form communities, to build people together who lived with this living Christ so that they would express and embody his good life in themselves. That's what Paul did in person. It's what he does in every letter that he writes to every church that we have in what we call our New Testament. Paul was forming Christ-like communities, Christoformity in the lives of individual people, but the lives of the group together. And as Paul gets to the end of Ephesians, what's been underlying all that he says comes out into the open. And how he brings it out in the open might strike us as really strange. He puts on the middle of the table all along that we might not have seen. And that's what we're going to look at fairly simply today. And I'm going to just warn you, we'll have it fairly interactive today. If you're not a speaker-upperer, grab some courage. If you're someone who does not, shut up. Not that anyone hears that. Let someone else have a go. That's what we're going to do. Paul is talking about how God brings his kingdom to earth now. He brought it in his Messiah, his King, Jesus. But how is his kingdom experienced now by his people, the people of the Messiah? What does that look like in us? And the way he wants to get them and us too thinking about it as we engage with his letter is to think about his present circumstances as it relates to us, them, his readers. Paul has been speaking about Jesus, but now he's going to speak about himself. And those two things, and here is the mystery, always go together. This is how Paul did life because of what he believed about life. The present circumstances in which he is writing this letter, alone in Rome, in prison, he connects to the present experiences of those living in Ephesus and for us, his readers, now. Why? It's because of what Paul believed as foundational about life. He had a belief about life and about Christian spirituality. And I'll put it in one sentence. It's this. The personal is formational because life is relational. Paul's personal experiences will form the community he's writing to because all life is actually relational. How we are connected to one another shapes who we are more than anything else. This is Paul's approach to his spirituality because it's his understanding of life. Paul's captivity in prison is connected to their liberation in the gospel. And he wants them to understand how those two things work together. His personal circumstances affect them profoundly because he's connected to them. He has a relationship with them. And this is his way of being with them. Separated by great distance and separated by circumstance, he's nonetheless with them. He has a connection with them. And that's what he's doing as he writes his letter. If our reconstruction is correct, Paul is sitting alone in Rome while he has one or two friends with him. What happens, if we're correct, is that he gets freed from prison, but then is later arrested again and beheaded. But as he sits in prison now, everything's on the line. The Ephesians, as they receive this letter, don't know what's happening in Rome, whether Paul lives or dies. But he wants to say to them something that's significant in that connection. He wants them to see that he's got them on his mind and his heart. They are precious to him. He's concerned about them. And he wants, as they hear this letter read, for them to imagine him sitting alone in house arrest. Why? Because he's conscious that they might be very discouraged. They themselves are facing challenges, but they're distressed at Paul's challenges. Here's a man they love. They've spent at least a couple of years with this guy every day as he lived in their town. He's dear to them. And to see their friends suffering in this way distresses them. But more than that, it makes them wonder, what's the way for me if I follow this same Jesus? If I live like Paul, is this what awaits me too? Is this what it means if you follow Jesus, you suffer? If that's what it is, do I really want to choose this way to live? How is God's plan at work? We're talking about Christ's overall rule and authority, and look at what happens to Paul. How does all this work out together? This is what's been the undercurrent of his whole letter. And there are little glimpses where this bubbles to the surface, but which will emerge at the very end. For example, in chapter 3, he says, I, Paul, after 2 fantastic chapters about speaking about Jesus, brings it into practice. I, Paul, am a prisoner because of the Romans, the Jews, because of Christ Jesus. I'm in prison because of my work among you who are Gentiles. Literally, Paul got into trouble with those in power because he was speaking a message that says you are welcome into God's people, you Gentiles. And that wasn't very popular. It said live a new way. And those who liked the old way were not happy with people changing. And so he was imprisoned. Out of his faithfulness in proclaiming Christ, he suffers. You can imagine, can't you, how they might be feeling. If you think this guy whom you esteem is suffering because of you, something he did to help you, how do you think you might feel? Tell me. Guilty. Resentful, can you say more? So Paul might feel resentful. If I had my time again, I would have said nothing. He wants them to know if he had his time again, he'd do exactly the same, but we'll get to that. They, I think, would feel discouraged. They would feel ashamed. They would feel guilty. They would feel distressed. Perhaps the only thing worse than suffering ourselves is seeing someone we love suffer. It's hard to bear that. But Paul deliberately says, I want you to picture me here in chains for you. I'm not beating around the bush here. I'm just telling you directly, this is what is going on. He speaks the unspoken all the time, Paul. He doesn't play secret games. Paul knows the Ephesians, and he knows that as they watch what he goes through, their faith becomes weak. They lose the courage within, and so he seeks to encourage them, to give them strength, to not hide away their faith, not give up at us, well, it doesn't work, does it? Look at, he's the top of the tree, and look what's happening to him. Paul says, I ask you not to lose heart over what I am suffering for you, which is your glory. My poverty is your splendour. Why? Because it shows how much I value you. It shows how much you are worth to me and to God, that I will suffer like this because I love you. Some of you know what that's like. Maybe we should all know it every day, to suffer out of love for the service of another. This is what Paul always teaches, to love others. And this is what he does. But there are consequences sometimes when we do that. And Paul says there have been consequences for me. To help you has had repercussions in my life which are not good. But I have no bitterness. If I had my time again, I would do the same. Do not be discouraged. I'm not ashamed of it. I would do it again 100 times, he says. And I want you to learn this lesson from me. Because sometimes as you follow Jesus, Ephesians, as you follow Jesus, people of Gordon, you will face challenges and suffering. And you'll think, oh, I don't know if I want to do it anymore. It's just too hard. Or, you have all these lofty promises you hear about in church, and it doesn't work out in my life. It's a sham. It's a joke. It's a job. And we lose courage. We lose hope. We lose confidence in our faith. And Paul says, I get that. I understand that. I wrestle with those things myself, and I'm going to tell you about it so that you can learn from me about how not to be discouraged, to keep following Jesus faithfully. He's putting himself out there as a model to the Ephesians to learn from his experience. Personal is formational because life is relational. I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, he keeps coming back to that idea, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Don't weaken. Don't give in. Keep walking. Because it's not really the Romans to blame. It's not the Jewish leaders to blame. There is something behind all these circumstances that have a bent against God and that bring all the evil and suffering into the world, and you need to be alert to those. As Vanessa taught us so well, be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the whole armour of God that you'll be able to stand not against the Romans but the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armour of God that may be able to withstand in the evil day, having done them all, to stand firm. Stand. Don't put off the track. See and understand things through this lens. And understand that that's where the wrestle takes place. We can be tempted. We can be encouraged to give up. That's the devil's work. And Paul says, you need to be alert to work on your heart. What's inside of you. See that these things, these circumstances speak of a deeper imprisonment that we have. Paul is in chains, but there are many things that keep us in bondage. Are there not? What things keep you in bondage at the moment? What fears, anxieties, bad habits, wrong values or motivations? What problems and wrestles that distract you, that discourage, that depress you? What things do you just repeatedly fail in or don't want to face? These things imprison us. Paul says, I understand that. When life is hard, it is hard. We are fighting a big fight here. And we don't always feel like winners. We often look like losers. But don't give in. Stand firm. Stand on this Jesus. Clothe yourself with him to find strength in your circumstances. You're not alone. There's nothing that's wrong with you that causes this experience. It's the way the world is, and you will experience this as you follow Christ. But we struggle. We refuse to face those things in ourselves. I do this. I look at those things in me, and I hide them from others out of shame. Or I split things off into good and to bad. I even let them disconnect me from God. I don't want to speak about that with you, God. Bury it. This is not the way to deal with our issues. Do what Paul does and put it on the table. We need to be with God. We need to be with others. Which is why Paul immediately, after all that he said, gets down to the very basic thing of communication. And spirituality is all about speaking and listening. This is how we do relationships. The Christian life is a life of speaking and listening. This is how we are connected to each other. Firstly, he says, speak to God. Then he says, speak to one another. This is why he speaks about prayer. At all times, pray by the power of the Spirit. Pray all kinds of prayers. Be watchful so that you can pray. Always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. Pray also for me. Pray that whenever I speak, the right words will be given to me. Then I can be bold as I tell the mystery of the good news. Because of the good news, I am being held by chains as the Lord's messenger. So pray that I too will be bold as I preach the good news. That's what I should do. Paul says, will you just be with me in my need? Speak to God for me as I speak to God about me, because I know it's easy to be scared and to hide. But I want to be bold. I want to keep speaking out, even though it's got negative consequences for me. And in fact, everyone needs that. Everyone faces a fight. Whether it's sharing their faith or other things in life, we must pray for one another to get courage and support and confidence to deal honestly in life. Pray for others, says Paul. This is how we are with each other. This is how we partner with each other in praying. This is how we are connected to each other. How in our mind and in our heart we are joined in our experience of life. Paul, the ambassador, the apostle, is bound in chains. How can he deliver a message if he's there in prison? He can't. You think, well, that's what a waste of time. But he's not discouraged. He says, I still want to keep speaking in whatever circumstances I am able. This is how he connects and how he wants the Ephesians to connect with God and support one another. Don't be overwhelmed by that hardship. To God, but also to one another. Paul is about to say, I want to tell you what's really happening to me. But how does he do that? If we're right and he's in Rome and they're in Ephesus, it's a bit of a long way to shout. There's no FaceTime. There's no telephone. What's he going to do? He's going to do what you did in the ancient world, what we used to do in the world not so long ago. He writes a letter. In Paul's day, there was, except for those in official Roman business, government, military, Augustus decided that the best way to send a letter was not to do the Pony Express, where you pass it on to one guy on a horse, to the next guy on a horse, to the next guy. You send one person with it the whole way, who hears you the letter and gets it safely to who you want to address and reads it out and explains you the bits you don't get. And that's how they did it in Paul's day. If you read any of his letters, at the end of the letter, he'll say who it is that's bringing this letter, and we'll read it to you and we'll explain to you the bits that you don't understand, because most of us don't understand what Paul writes. If in the Romans, he sends a woman called Phoebe. In Ephesians, he sends a bloke called Tychicus. So that you may know how I am. What does he want them to know? How I am. And what I'm doing, well, I know what he's doing in prison, but what actually is he doing? Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful minister in the Lord, will tell you everything. I've sent him to you for this very purpose. You may know how we are, and that he may encourage your hearts. This was always Paul's way of mission. This is how he built the church, by sharing life with people, by being open and vulnerable about himself. The personal is formational because life is relational. Let's imagine Paul sitting there in prison, dictating what he wants to say. Tychicus is the scribe and writes it down. Paul probably had shock and vision like me, so he had amanuensis, a guy to write it for him, and he would just sign his name at the end. He writes the letter, he explains to Tychicus, and off Tychicus goes to make this long, I don't know how long it took to get from Rome to Ephesus, but I'm sure it wasn't just going around the block. The guy arrives, stands up to the church assembled, and he reads the letter. What's he going to say next? What's he going to explain? What's the everything you think Tychicus will say not written in the letter? What sort of things will Paul want them to hear? Yell out. What do you imagine Paul's feeling sitting there in prison alone? Can you picture him? Happening inside of him? He's a human being like us. What does he want them to know? What's Tychicus going to say? How would you feel? Imagine you're Paul. What do you think you would be feeling? Maybe that's an easier one to answer. Scared. Literally, his head's on the block. This is the end for me. It's not a nice death. He's going to die. Frightening. Very frustrating. He's lived for years moving around, compelled by this wonderful message he wants to share, and now he's in chains. How can an ambassador work when he's in chains? Apostle sent. He's going nowhere. What else is he feeling? How would you be feeling? What would you be feeling? Lonely. That's the word I come up with. When life gets too much for us, maybe you've had those experiences, maybe even recently, you think, here I am on my own. Is there any help? There is no one to help. There's no one even to understand. I could talk about it, no one's really going to know what you feel. You feel incredibly lonely in that sense. And the thing is, we all feel that. We all have these times of loneliness. It's the plague, not just of the modern world, but of every age. But I guess our culture is just becoming more attuned to this. The state government has just set up a new commission, started a couple of weeks ago, focused on loneliness. It's a problem. Pandemic magnified loneliness. But it's always there. And we have it at different seasons in our life. They say the number one lonely group is women aged over 75 because they are alone. Husband or bloke has died off because we're not so wise. But second to them is middle-aged men because we are useless at friendship. We don't have people we can talk on with. And then teenagers, loneliness. They have had more opportunity to be connected through a little screen, but they are never more lonely than they are at the moment. They don't have personal connections in the way that maybe we grew up having personal connections. All these things exacerbate loneliness, but it's always there. We all have those times, and that's what I imagine Paul sitting in incredible loneliness. No one understands what it's like for him. Yet his focus is them. He wants to be with them and way himself to them and them to him. He does this, he speaks about himself because it's good for him as well as good for them. This is what a mature person does. Harry Emerson Fosdick said, the central business of every human being is to be a real person. To be real. To be genuinely who you are and not hide that away. To express that to yourself and to others. To be consistent in that. That's what Paul does. He says, this is what I'm feeling. I want you to know. He makes himself vulnerable. I want you to know what I'm feeling. Tychicus is going to tell you. I can't. I wish I could tell you, but I can't. I'm here in chains, but he will tell you what's going on for me. This is the only way of communication. Can you do that with your relationships? Can you be a real person in your marriage, with your children, with your parents, with your friends, with your church friends? Can you be a real person? Or do you play a role? In some ways, it's harder to be real with those we are most connected with because how we act, they respond, and that impacts us. And if you've got to live with those people, you maybe get careful about what you let out. And so even from to us, we hide things. We stop being real. We just play a role. Paul says, be real. And that's what he models to us. Paul deals with his loneliness. There was a study done by a psychiatry department in the University of California that examined loneliness, particularly in older people issues, and they found a startling thing, that the best thing to deal with your own loneliness is to be kind. To not focus on yourself and be kind to others. If you're someone who feels lonely, you get connected with yourself. I'm sure you have met people like that, and maybe you're a person or are at the moment. And all they do is, woe is me. I'm not saying deny your feelings. I'm saying one way of dealing with those feelings and getting yourself out of those is to think of the needs of others. Because that builds relationship. That builds connection, which is the cure to loneliness. To think of others first, to be kind. That's what Paul does, which about this man. Paul is always modelling, not just preaching. And so when we read his letters, we don't just read the content, we see what he's doing through that content. You might know like speech act theory, but he's achieving something by his words. What he does has power, not just what he says. And so he's showing them how to live, and self-disclosure is part of that. Because the personal is formational, because life is relational. What things are imprisoning you now? How do you deal with those things? Can you face them and be honest with yourself, to those close by you whom you trust, or not? Which gets us to how Paul deals with their feelings. How does he think about the Ephesians? He's worried that they will be discouraged and give up following Jesus, or at least just dial it down, play it safe. He could say, don't feel like that. I said that to a kid. Stop being angry. Don't feel sad. Don't worry about that. When you say those words, does it take any of those feelings away? Do you stop being angry or worrying or sad when someone tells you not to? It does the opposite. It makes you isolated with those feelings. It says to you, you're not allowed to have those feelings. They're upsetting to me. My feelings are more important than your feelings, so stop it. But you're left alone with those feelings. We cannot push someone else to feel what we want them to feel, and Paul does not do that. So when he says don't be discouraged, he doesn't say, oh, just think happy thoughts, be distracted. Sing a few hymns. He wants to give them a space to sit with what they're experiencing together with him. And that's what he's modelling to them. I'm going to let you sit next to me in my mess, in my discouragement, so that you learn how I deal with discouragement so that you won't be discouraged. This is how we do good relationships. He's bringing coherence or congruence to a story about life. What happens to us and the relationships that we have shape and form who we are. That happens from the womb. How people relate to us. How as little children we are formed by those relationships. What gets presented back to us. Life is relational. So is spirituality. Because really that's the same thing. Paul is comfortable with uncomfortable feelings. The personal is foundational because life is relational. That's what he's doing at the end of this letter. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be my real self with you. And I want you to be your real selves with me. And Tychicus here, he'll be the means of communication. Paul was an amazing man. But what he spoke about and what he wrote in his letters as the way of following Jesus is not a set of spiritual principles or insights or theology. All of those things are about relationship with God and others. That's what Jesus taught too, didn't he? The most important stuff, the biggest instructions in life is to love God and love others. It's about relationship. And so as Paul writes, he's saying, okay, maybe you don't get my cosmic Christology and all this stuff that I'm going on with, but I want you to get this. Be with each other. This is how we follow Jesus together. Because he is with us. That's the thing. Jesus is comfortable with uncomfortable feelings. The resurrected Christ can cope with anything. Nothing's going to discourage him and put him off loving you. So bring it to him. And bring it to one another. It's hard to do. But if we do these things, then the very last thing that Paul writes about is what happens. His wish for them, his blessing for them takes place. Can we read these words together as a blessing upon one another? Peace be to the brothers and sisters and love with faith from God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace be with all who love our Lord Jesus Christ with a love incorruptible. Amen. I think we'll sing a song.